My speaker today is Susan Wilson. Susan knows everything. She is a literary and cultural historian of all things about Boston extraordinaire. She's written many books about Boston history, including The Literary Trail of Greater Boston, Boston Sights and Insights, and a book about the Forest Hill Cemetery called Garden of Memories, a guide to historic Forest Hills. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Susan Wilson.
Thank you. I have to tell you, this is a unique event here. I got here a half an hour ago and was looking around and went, well, it's not here, it's not happening. And they said, no, really, it just pops up out of nowhere and suddenly there's this whole thing happening. When I was 21 years old, my first job out of college was I was a 7th grade social studies teacher. And I did that during the daytime, and at nighttime I played in a rock band because didn't everybody? And we were the house band at the Village Inn Pizza Parlor, and this reminds me a lot of that. We used to do live recordings of our music, and there'd be music in the background, and then you'd hear pizza order number 32 in the background. So this is giving me a wonderful flashback. I love it. All right, this is a Q&A. Name 2 foods that were invented at the Parker House. Raise your hands. Yes, sir.
Boston cream pie.
Boston cream pie.
Parker House rolls.
Parker House rolls. Okay. The Parker House is the oldest continuously operating hotel in the United States. It began back in 1855, which means 6 years before the Civil War even began, there was a Parker House Hotel. Everybody who was anybody stayed there. It was a very, very significant hotel and continues to be today, but there was a time when there was much less competition. And one of the famous people who stayed there was a guy named Sam Clemens. Does anyone know by what name he was more popularly known? Yes. Mark Twain. So Sam Clemens, aka Mark Twain, was staying there. He was already very famous in 1877, and he was sitting in his room, and a gentleman from the Globe wanted to interview him. So the gentleman from the Globe was brought to the door. He went into the door where Mark Twain was in his room, and Mark Twain's back was turned to him. So the guy walks in, and Mark Twain's like this, and he's holding a cigar in one hand and a newspaper in the other. And he pauses, and the reporter waits, and then Twain turns around and says, "As you can clearly see, I'm pretty near heaven. Not theologically, of course, but by the hotel standard." If that isn't a book title, I don't know what is. So we borrowed it, adapted it a bit, and this became Heaven by Hotel Standards. Now, does anyone know, first of all, why I have to use all those adjectives in describing the Parker House? I didn't say it's the oldest hotel. I said it's the oldest continuously operating hotel in the United States. Why do I have all those adjectives? Any idea? Okay, pretty much if you ever say the first or the oldest or the longest, you're lying unless you add at least 1, if not 3 adjectives, okay? It's got to be the first, really old, in its original place, da-da-da-da. The thing with the Parker House is there are a couple of hotels in other cities we won't mention that are older, but when they had a renovation, they shut down completely, obliterated what was there, built something new, and reopened a year, 2 years, or 3 years later. What happened with the Parker House was it opened in 1855, and in 1925 they decided they wanted to build something much more modern and sleek, whatever. And so they started tearing it down in 1825, but they left a back annex with about 80 rooms open. And so during this demolition, what fun, people came and stayed in the annex for those 2 years, and then they had their grand reopening, and it was all rebuilt, and but it never really closed. So that's how we get to be the oldest continuously operating hotel in the US. Now, what did people do before hotels? Okay, because hotels are actually a pretty new thing. What did people do before hotels? Yes, the gentleman standing.
They slept with what?
Queequeg. With queequeg. Okay, could you explain that further, sir?
Boarding houses.
Boarding houses, okay. let's just say that before hotels, ladies didn't travel a whole lot because it was not nice, okay? Very often people would stay in what we called taverns or inns, which would mean on the main floor, a bunch of guys would be sitting and drinking, and drinking, and drinking, and drinking. Then they'd eat a little and drink, okay? And then they would tumble, if you can tumble up, upstairs into a few beds that were there. There might be 4 or 5 guys in one bed. It was filthy, it was dangerous, people got robbed, they got murdered. It was really a fun time. So ladies did not travel a whole lot, okay? But by the second quarter of the 19th century, so we're talking 1825 to 50, things had settled down quite a bit, and we were getting more civilized, we had more money, and ladies wanted to travel, and more people were taking stagecoaches, horses, etc., and traveling. And so they needed to develop something where ladies could be acceptable, okay, and not be in danger, and live in lovely circumstances, not like those old inns and taverns. And this is where the Parker House came in. At the time, it was built by a gentleman named, of all things, Harvey Parker. By the time this happened, there were other houses, which was the common name for hotel at that time, all with very patriotic names, like in Boston, the Revere House, the American House, names like that. Tremont House, Shawmut House. Shawmut was the original name of Boston when the local natives were here. But then Harvey said, you know, I can do this better. Now, he didn't come from a lodging family. He didn't come from a family that knew anything about food or anything like that. He was a small town boy. He actually was born in 1805 in Maine. And the first evidence that Harvey Parker of Parker House fame was going to get into food came in Paris, Maine. Because he worked in an apple orchard. He was just earning money and trying to figure out what he wanted to be. He was one of 13 children, so he didn't expect to get much from his dad, okay? So he decided, there's a lot of people at the courthouse midday and they're hungry. So he would get the apples from the apple orchard, bring them over to the courthouse at midday and sell them for a nickel apiece. So this was Harvey Parker's first culinary enterprise, okay? He then eventually took a packet, came down to Boston, got a few odd jobs like driving coaches for especially a rich woman from Watertown. And every time he came into town, not far from where the Parker House is today, around where the courthouse was, and that's the Boston School building, there was a little cafe underground called Hunt's Cafe. And he would eat there while he was waiting to take the woman back to Watertown in the coach. And he fell in love with that place, so he saved and saved and saved, and he bought Hunt's Cafe and opened a restaurant. This little kid who had no experience, okay, he was a little, 25 by then, had no experience other than selling apples in Paris, Maine. And he perfected it there. Now, when he opened the Parker House in 1855, people go, wow, he opened a world-class hotel and a world-class restaurant, and people from, everywhere thought it was the greatest in the world. He had no experience. Not true. He'd been running this this restaurant that he called Parker's over at Hunt's Cafe for more than 20 years. So people in town already knew Harvey Parker was great. He treated you well. He gave you a good meal. And this was the group of people who came in 1855 when he opened this amazing Parker House. Now, what street is the Parker House located on? School, okay? Why would anybody literary go to School Street? Because we're we're being co-sponsored by the Boston Literary District. Why would anybody literary be on School Street? Yes?
The site of the first school in Boston.
Okay, you ever heard of Boston Latin? Boston Latin is the first school, public school in the United States. That was right across the street. Okay, right across the street. But down the street, where is now the Chipotle Grill, well, they're everywhere, but one of the Chipotle Grills down the street is in the building called the Old Corner Bookstore Building. This is where modern publishing was born, okay? When you think about the golden age of American literature, when the first great American writers were happening, people like Longfellow, Hawthorne, Emerson, Whittier, Louisa May Alcott, all of these people, okay, this was the place that was the center of that. This is where everybody went to get published. Louisa May Alcott brought a manuscript into the Old Corner Bookstore just down the street, okay, from the Parker House. And James Fields, who was the A&R guy there, looked at her work, and she was a school teacher at the time, and he looked at her work and said, I'm going to give you $40 for school books, for benches and stuff like that. Stick to your teaching, you can't write. That was Louisa May Alcott, so don't believe every rejection you get. She later went with Roberts Publishers. She later became a multi-millionaire and one of the best-selling authors in the United States. On the other hand, the guys down at the Old Corner Bookstore were friends with this guy, Hawthorne, Nathaniel. Okay, these are all names that were happening at this time. And went up to his place. He was living at Salem at the time. And Jamie Fields went up and said, I have the feeling that you're working on something here. And Hawthorne said, nope, I'm not working on anything. I'm just doing my job at the Custom House, not doing anything. He said, no, I just have this feeling you're working on something. And Hawthorne went into his back room and he pulled out a roll of paper and said, okay, I don't know how you thought I was working on something, but here it is, read it. It may be good, it may be terrible, I have no idea. And so he took the train back and Jamie Fields started reading The Scarlet Letter. So he did make that discovery. But anyway, so we've got at the bottom of the block where the Parker House is, we've got the Old Corner Bookstore. At the top of the block, we have the oldest library in Boston. What is that? The Athenaeum, okay? In 1850, there was no Boston Public Library. The second largest library in the United States was the Boston Athenaeum. You know what the first was? The Library of Congress. Okay, so this was a big deal. Now, yeah, that university across the river, they had a library too, okay? But we're talking about downtown Boston. So we have the Parker House halfway between one of the biggest, most important libraries in the United States and the Old Corner Bookstore. So when all these famous dudes got together, where did they eat? The Parker House, okay? No brainer. Now the thing is, yes, location is a part of it, okay? However, Harvey Parker had created something spectacular. He didn't want to do anything halfway. He wanted a beautiful place. He wanted, sparkling chandeliers and bronze doors and doorknobs, comfy chairs, a great ambiance, and he also wanted the best food in the world. And we also know that he was serving what? Boston cream pie and Parker House rolls and scrod. Yes, okay. There were other things on the menu, however, those are the things we need to remember. So anyway, this gang, the people who invented American literature, I must mention the guys. Louisa May was not invited. This was a boys' club. They created a group called the Saturday Club. And the Saturday Club had some of the greatest writers in all of history. Okay, names that I've already mentioned like Longfellow. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow was a member. Who else? Nathaniel Hawthorne was a member. Ralph Waldo Emerson was a member. Also a bunch of people like, Whittier, the poet, Louis Agassiz, the scientist, Parkman, the historian. So big shots came to these meetings. The last Saturday of every month, they would meet in the afternoon at the Parker House for many years. In fact, their descendants continued to have it for decades thereafter. Anyway, they would sit and they would drink and have multi-course meals, and they would read to each other and test out things. They would greet luminaries from other places. For example, when the greatest British author of the era, the big superstar, came to town, who would that be in the 1860s? Charles Dickens. Where did he stay? The Parker House, okay? And if you go to the Parker House today, you can still see on the mezzanine level a large mirror at the end, which is the mirror that Charles Dickens used to practice in front of. Because what he would do is he would do readings. Now, nowadays when authors do readings, okay, you get a nice audience. Sometimes you get a couple of dozen, sometimes you get a couple of hundred. In those days, literary people like Charles Dickens were like rock stars. Really, seriously, like rock stars. Dickens would get 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 people sitting in the audience ready for him to read. Now, he didn't just read, Dickens was quite flamboyant. And this is one of the reasons he needed the mirror at the Parker House. Because if he was doing something like A Christmas Carol, he would set up this little stool, he would have an open book even though he knew everything by heart. He would stand there, have a glass of water on the side, and he would do all the parts. He would do Ebenezer Scrooge, and he would do Tiny Tim, and he would do everybody in between, changing outfits, pulling his hat off with his cravat and his, his scarf and his long flowing cape, etc. And it was quite a show. And like rock stars today, they had to have bodyguards at the Parker House to guard him, because autograph seekers or people who wanted to touch Charles Dickens would be lining up outside, trying to get a signature, trying to touch him, trying to watch him practicing in front of the mirror. If you go to the Parker House today, you can not only see that mirror, but there is pizza order number 32. I love it. There is also in the main lobby, you can look in one of the display cases, there is the key to Dickens' room. And also there's a small conference room that still has the mantle that was in Dickens' original room. Now, why is the room not actually Dickens' room? They've got stuff that was in his room. Does anyone remember something I told you before? Remember how they tore the whole place down? Okay, so when they tore the whole place down over a 2-year period from 25 to 27, the old building was demolished. If you can see the cover of the book, okay, on the top, that big, gorgeous, Victorian monstrosity, wonderful thing, that was the old Parker House. And when you flip it, this sleek, wonderful, box-like structure is what the Parker House looked like afterwards and looks like today. Okay. Now, a lot of people get very upset when I show them the old Victorian Parker House and go, "That's gorgeous." But in the 1920s, this Victorian stuff that we think is awesome and gorgeous and wonderful and ornate today, most people thought was gaudy, overdone, overly lavish, just way, way too much, and over the top, and they wanted sleek, simple, modern. The thing about the Parker House was, even though they modernized the outside, and basically what you see today is what happened in 1925 to 27, what they built then, but the inside is still very, very much like the 19th century, and that's what people love about it. That's one of the special things about it. Now, the Saturday Club was not the only literary connection at the Parker House. As I mentioned, Mark Twain came there and gave me a book name. Thank you, Mark. There was this woman who was a reporter. You ever remember the name of the magazine called McClure's? Does that strike a bell? Okay, you're clearly not 100 years old. McClure's was a giant magazine, very important, out of New York. And there was a young woman who was a reporter for McClure's who was sent to come to Boston and write a story about a really famous Boston woman who invented a religion. Who was that Boston woman? Mary Baker Eddy, okay? The name of the reporter from New York, the cub reporter, was Willa Cather, okay? So she came, she was told to write about Mary Baker Eddy. Good thing she came 1906, 1907, because within a couple of years, Mary Baker Eddy was gone. I mean, gone. And Willa Cather stayed at the Parker House that entire year because that's where you stayed. It was sophisticated, it was literary. She loved the fact that if she went into this room, that's where Emerson was, and that's where Longfellow was. It was just a very, very exciting thing. And Dickens' mirror was still there, and she could look at herself in Dickens' mirror. And she also made friends with several people. One of them, remember I told you about Jamie Fields, who used to do work at the Old Corner bookstore, and he was the one that rejected Louisa May Alcott but found out that Hawthorne was writing a Scarlet Letter. He died, but his much younger wife continued to be connected with the Parker House, and her name was Annie Adams Fields. And Annie Adams was very close to a woman named Sarah Orne Jewett, who was another famous author. And these two women collected other women writers because it was much harder, despite Louisa May Alcott, it was much harder for women to get the same kind of deals that men would get. So they kind of adopted Willa Cather. Willa thought, when she was up here working on her story, that she needed to write as if she was a man. I'm not exactly sure what that means. All I know is she would pretend that she was a man and write from a man's perspective. And her two female friends said, no. You're something different. Write as if you were a woman. Oh, you are a woman. Write from that perspective and start doing that. And this was a big break in Willa Cather that got her eventually beyond McClure's and into writing the novels we know her for today. So that was very important to her. Another person, another literary person, Edith Wharton. Do you know that name? Where does she have an awesome house? In Lenox at the Mount, okay? Nice little place. She didn't make that as an author, okay? That was family money. Anyway, she used to write, Edith Wharton was actually born Edith Newbold Jones. Do you know the expression, keeping up with the Joneses? That was her family, okay? Now, there are people who disagree with this, but the Joneses were so rich that there are two different theories, but it's split and nobody will prove it today. Their family was so rich that indeed keeping up with the Joneses was credited to their family for many years, and we think it's true. Some people don't think it's true, but that's how rich they were. Now, she married a Wharton, became a Wharton, and whenever she wrote novels, she was based in New York, but her people would travel. They would travel to Europe, they would travel to Boston. If her characters in her novels traveled to Boston, where would they stay? The Parker House, okay? So if you go back to the Age of Innocence, and remember that you can go to the movie if you want to, or you can go back to the book, okay? You'll remember that the suitor, Newland Archer, is just always, he's madly in love with the Countess Olenska, and it never just works out. But the last place he stalks her, comes after her, is in Boston. And well, let me just read you one little segment of that. He finds her and says the following. Hold on. Oh, I got it. It's good, it's good. She was staying at the Parker House, okay? He said, "You're alone? At the Parker House?" he asked incredulously. She responds, flashing her old malice, saying, "Does it strike you as dangerous? Unconventional?" "I see. I suppose it is." Okay, so I don't know what was so dangerous about staying at the Parker House, but I think the big deal is she was staying there alone. Now, speaking of the Parker House, I like to connect other kinds of writing besides just people who wrote novels and things like that. And have you heard of the composer, the French composer named Jacques Offenbach? How many people have heard of Offenbach? Okay, big deal in the 1870s. However, Offenbach, well, at the time, he was writing a lot of things called operettas. And an operetta today is not far away from what we would call a musical comedy, okay? It was light, it was not considered as serious or as deep as opera. But Offenbach was creating operetta after operetta. And he was living in France, and he discovered that he was broke. Now, if you're a famous musician, especially a classical musician or composer living in Europe and you're broke, what do? You tour America, okay? Because Americans are dying for that kind of culture. This is, we're talking about the 1870s. The BSO, the Boston Symphony Orchestra, wasn't even invented until 1881. So we still didn't have our own real serious orchestra. So anyone classical coming from Europe, that was a very big deal, okay? So Offenbach decided to come to America and do a tour to make some money because he was broke. Because he was a big shot and important, where did he stay? We got it, okay? He stayed at the Parker House. And he was sitting in Parker's restaurant. Now, Parker's has always had a main restaurant and then little cafes, but Parker's is the big restaurant. And he was served a Parker House roll. And he was elated. Jacques Offenbach sat there with his French accent and went, "Parker House rolls, I love you, and started singing a song. The tune he created became the foundation for Les Contes d'Hoffmann, which is the Tales of Hoffmann, which is his only opera. It was inspired by a Parker House roll, okay? So, you know, things go a long way. I don't know any song based on Scrod, but I probably would be banned immediately. You're taking that one too far. Another inspiration. I want to go into another thing that I wanted to tell you. Harvey Parker was a great host, and he loved having famous people, especially theatrical people, come there. And a guy in Boston who grew in Boston and became one of the greatest actors in the United States was named Edwin Booth. Does that name sound familiar? Okay, he had this brother, okay? Actually, Edwin Booth had two brothers. All three of them were actors. But Edwin was really based in Boston. He loved the Parker House. He made his debut at the Boston Theater, and a whole lot of his early life was in Boston. Later he moved to New York, but he loved Boston so much that even though he was a New Yorker, he decided when he died he wanted to be buried here, and Edwin Booth is buried at Mount Auburn Cemetery. Yeah, most people would assume he'd be in New York. But it was 1865, and Edwin Booth was playing in a show in town, and his brother, John Wilkes, came to town. Now, Edwin, okay, the Bostonian, was a much more serious actor. He was Shakespearean, he could do all the serious stuff. His brother, John Wilkes, was more an Errol Flynn type. Okay, he was good at, he was like a matinee idol. He had wavy hair, he was considered very handsome. He liked to do flashing sword play and leaping on stage and doing all these fancy tricks and stuff. But he wasn't nearly the actor that Edwin was. The other difference between them was John Wilkes Booth was a Confederate sympathizer, whereas Edwin, the very, very first election he voted in was voting Lincoln in as president because he truly believed in Lincoln. So the family was split that way. The first week of April in 1865, John Wilkes came to town. He was actually seen in the Ladies' Cafe dining with a lady, and the newspapers reported that because, as I mentioned, it was very important for ladies to feel as comfortable as possible, and so they could eat in the main restaurant, but they also could have their own cafe and invite gentlemen in. Okay, so he was sitting there with a lady. People noticed how handsome John Wilkes Booth was there. But there were other reports in the local newspapers about gun shooting. Now, at that time, in the 1850s, 60s, etc., it was still dangerous traveling. Okay, remember how I told you it was dangerous in the old days when people stayed in the inns and taverns? It was still very dangerous traveling, and it wasn't unusual at all for people to be carrying a revolver with them to protect themselves, okay? And so apparently John Wilkes Booth was noted, and local newspapers noted this because he was famous, that he was going down to this local shooting gallery and practicing his aim. And the reason people noticed it was partly because he was the famous swashbuckling actor John Wilkes Booth, but also because when he was practicing, he was like shooting over his shoulder and under his legs and doing all kinds of trick stuff with his shooting. 8 days later, he went to Washington, D.C. and assassinated Lincoln. Okay, so he practiced at the Parker House. Harvey Parker did not like to talk about this guest. It was not one of his favorite guests, okay? Now, another book that has a connection to the Parker House is Henrietta Nesbitt's book called The Presidential Cookbook. Now, what the heck does this have to do with the Parker House, okay? Well, it seems that Henrietta Nesbitt was the longtime cook and baker for Eleanor Roosevelt. Have you guys been watching the Eleanor and Franklin on the Ken Burns thing? It's a wonderful show. Eleanor loved good food. Okay, Eleanor adored good food, and back when she and Franklin Roosevelt were living in New York and he was the governor there and contemplating running for the presidency, they had a neighbor named Henrietta Nesbitt. And Henrietta was a wonderful baker, and she could make muffins and breads and cakes and all that kind of stuff. And when they were having events in Hyde Park, Eleanor would always call up Henrietta and say, "Can you come and bake for us for this big event? We're having a lot of important people here." Well, needless to say, when Franklin was elected the first time to the White House, Eleanor said, "We've got to have Henrietta Nesbitt come with us." So she came, brought her husband, who also began working at the White House, and throughout the entire time, Franklin and Eleanor were in the White House, and one term into Truman, she was the baker at the White House. Now, how does this connect to the Parker House? Parker House rolls had a secret recipe. You know how Coca-Cola allegedly has the secret recipe that's kept in this vault, and you can, analyze it, take it apart, and create some cola like it, but you can never get the exact recipe because it's this hidden thing? It was the same thing with Parker House rolls, okay? So it was a secret. A baker named Ward, we think his name might have been Kurt Ward, invented it at the Parker House. For sure it was there in the 1870s. We don't know exactly what year. And it was a secret. And they would ship Parker House rolls all around the world, and people would come in and go, "Oh my God, I love Parker House rolls." Now, who can describe a Parker House roll? I promise to get back to Eleanor. Who can describe, what's the big deal about a Parker House roll? Yes?
Split down the middle. Top is like
It's split down the middle. It's got a little crack, okay. What about the texture, consistency? It's soft and buttery and flaky, okay? Big deal. So's Wonder Bread, okay? Why was that so important? What was the big deal about Parker House rolls?
America's first stop on the world, big president.
Okay, but even more important than that, okay, was that before that, American breads were a lot like what we would call artisanal breads today, okay? Like that big, heavy stuff with a thick crust, except a lot of American breads would be big, thick, and heavy, have a thick crust, and be thick inside. There are known incidents at Harvard where in the dining halls there would be a food fight and guys would throw bread at each other and men lost their eyesight when hit with bread. I swear it's true, okay? There are numerous incidents where somebody got hit in the eye with a loaf of bread and lost his sight. That's how big and bulky the bread was. So no wonder this light, fluffy, wonderful European-style thing was a big deal, okay? So it was a secret recipe. They wouldn't share it. There are cookbooks from the 1890s and 1900s, even Fanny Farmer, okay, who was a local girl. Even Fanny Farmer did put a recipe for Parker House rolls, but it was her own interpretation. The recipe was secret until 1933, and Eleanor came to the Parker House. Now, Eleanor and her husband, Franklin, always stayed at the Parker House. They loved the Parker House. They were really good friends with James Michael Curley, who you remember was many times the mayor and many times a federal inmate in Boston. Okay, why was James Michael Curley at the Parker House all the time? City Hall, right across the street. You know the thing we call Old City Hall today? Right across the street. James Michael Curley ate there every day, was known for tipping silver dollars. Everybody loved him, okay? So anyway, so they would eat at the Parker House, and Eleanor fell in love with the Parker House rolls. And she said, I'd like the recipe. And they went, oh dear, okay, this has been a secret for longer than anyone can remember, but Eleanor Roosevelt just asked for the recipe. Did she get it? Well, it ended up in her cook's cookbook, so I'm guessing that and it was the exact same recipe as the Parker House. I did a bunch of research with the Franklin D. Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park, and we were going through letters and trying to find the letter, and could find no letters corroborating it. But the fact is, Eleanor probably, and they agreed with me, probably asked for the letter while she was there. I mean, I asked for the recipe while she was there, and it was sent to her. So the secret was out, and then later on, Sarah Lee made it, and et cetera, et cetera. So what are you going to do about that? The other great food besides Parker House rolls was, like he said, Boston cream pie, okay? It would be a little erroneous to say. Can anyone describe Boston cream pie? Anyone? Yes. You have two, okay, I'm going to repeat this. 2 layers of sponge cake. In the middle is a light custard, good. Glazed chocolate over the top. Do you want to go eat now, everyone? Okay. Anyway, so yes, a sponge cake. If it's a sponge cake, why is it called Boston cream pie? Yeah, it's a lie. It's a total lie, okay? It's Boston cream pie is a cake. It's that simple. We think that maybe in early America, pies were more common than cakes. And so that it was probably made in a pie pan, and therefore they called it a pie, okay? The thing is, it's not exactly true that the Parker House invented it. I would say they perfected and popularized it, okay? Because there was this thing very similar called a Boston or an American pudding cake pie that actually existed prior to this time. But in the Parker House kitchens, they made it exquisite. They made it just took it to a whole nother level with a cake sliced in half, the sponge cake, the custard in between, the chocolate drizzle, all kinds of beautiful designs on the top. And it became very, very famous and associated with them. Does anyone know in 1996 what great honor was bestowed on Boston cream pie? Anyone besides this one? Okay, this one. It became the official Massachusetts state dessert. Raise your hand if you knew that. Raise your hand if you care. I care. Okay. Anyway, every state has this slew of like 24 things, like the official state color, the official state bird. Nobody knows any of them. Do you know our state song? Me neither. You know, so, but it was a big deal. Now, here's the cool part though. It was a Norton High School class that lobbied for the Boston cream pie to become the official state dessert. What would you think in Massachusetts would be the primary competitors for a state dessert? Raise your hand. Yes. Toll House cookies invented by Ruth Wakefield. Yes. Excellent. Okay. Another one. So one of the competitors was Toll House cookies. Fig Newtons invented in the town of Newton. Okay. What's another no-brainer that goes back much farther? Indian pudding. Okay. So those were the prime contenders, but Boston cream pie won, and it's been a big deal ever since. Okay. Back before World War I, 1912, 1913, you can trace various ethnic groups coming in and out of the Parker House and working in the kitchens, working in, as staff, working whatever. And there was this one very talented gentleman there who came and worked there for a while, and he was clearly from the Far East. Okay, his name, he kept changing his name, but a lot of people knew him as Ba, B-A, and Ba was a wonderful baker. And he would go downstairs and cook there and do wonderful baked goods, and it was a really big deal. The thing was, baking was only his hobby. His real purpose was getting freedom for French Indochina and spreading world communism. We know him today as Ho Chi Minh. He was indeed a baker downstairs in the bakery at the Parker House. But he really was. I mean, he studied with Escoffier, he worked in New York, he worked on cruise ships, so while he made his money as a very, very talented baker while he was trying to get freedom for Southeast Asia, French Indochina, and spreading world communism. So popular that more than one time, starting in 2005, the Vietnamese delegation and the Prime Minister came here to the Parker House and wanted to go downstairs to see the table and see where Ho Chi Minh had worked. Ho Chi Minh was not his real name either. None of those. He just used fake names all the time. He had to. So if you get to go down in the bakery, in the bake shop at the Parker House, you'll see this old marble platter which is still used. You'll still see Parker House rolls there and Boston cream pie being thrown across it. It's got a cracked corner, but they're not going to throw that out because Ho Chi Minh worked there. Now, another person who was not particularly known for culinary things worked there. If you look at photos of the wait staff and the busboys in the 1940s, 30s, 40s, 50s, many of them are African American. And so it was very common at that time for African Americans, many of whom had worked on the trains, on the Pullman trains, to transfer their talents over to hotels because serving and giving out food and drinks and all that kind of stuff had been done on the Pullman trains. So this guy from the Midwest, his last name was Little, worked as a busboy. His first name was Malcolm. We now know him as Malcolm X. And if you read the autobiography of Malcolm X, which he wrote a little bit, but mostly Alex Haley wrote, you will find, I believe, one entire sentence mentioning the Parker House. Okay, so that was one of the jobs that he had as he was building himself. That was before he went to prison, but also before he wrote the autobiography and turned around his life when he adopted the Muslim religion. Okay, any other questions or things that people want to know? Because again, I can go off onto thousands and thousands of tangents. Yes, miss? Okay, other questions? What shall I talk about? Huh? Oh, tell them to buy the book. Okay. The reason you should buy the book. Okay, I'll give you more stories, okay? These aren't necessarily literary. One of the things about the Parker House is that many of the people that work there love it. It's kind of a large family. And there are people who have worked there for 20, 30, 40, and 50 years. One of the bellmen there is a guy named Eddie Cotto, who has memories. He started working there in the 1960s, and he has several memories of wonderful things that happened at the Parker House that are not necessarily literary, but are certainly entertaining. There was one woman who you might think was a prima donna, and she used to arrive in her limo, and she would wait. She wouldn't open the door. She would wait till you opened the door for her. And then she would stand at the door to the hotel. And she wouldn't push the door, she would wait for you to open it. And each step along the way, she would wait for something to do. Was she a prima donna? No, she really liked to tip people for everything. So every time everyone opened a door, pushed a door, picked up a bag, she would get to tip them and say thank you so much. Her name was Judy Garland, and she was one of the favorite guests at the Parker House, and Eddie Cotto loved to serve her there. Yes?
Eddie has worked in the Parker House for 48 years.
Eddie has worked technically for 48 years, okay? Now, another story that Eddie likes to tell, because the Parker House is so near the theater district, and again, eliminate all the hotels that have popped up over the past 30 years, okay, because that's all very new. So they're very near the theater district. And one night, a bunch of guys came in with this big coffin and just rolled it into the center and left it there and started leaving. And Eddie said, wait a second, what's the deal? There's a coffin sitting here in the middle of the Parker House. And they said, well, we have to leave it here. We don't know where else to put it. And they said, well, what's this related to? Well, it turns out there was this famous magician. What's his name? Not Houdini, no. What's his name? What's the famous Hollywood? Wasn't going to tell this story. The famous magician who does the big. He's very handsome and he does Vegas. Copperfield, that's it, thank you. Oh, see, there is a literary connection. Okay. David Copperfield was doing a show in town, and he did this thing where he sawed a coffin apart and people appeared out of the dark and stuff like that. They could not figure out what to do with the coffin. It wouldn't fit in his room, it wouldn't fit in the elevator. So Eddie did find a place to put that, another place to put that, no big deal. He remembers Muhammad Ali coming in there, Hugh Hefner coming in. Hugh Hefner would have parties with lots and lots of young women there. At the time when he used to come to the Parker House, Barbie Benton, do you remember that name? That's when his girlfriends used to be only 10 or 15 years. Oh, you approve of Barbie Benton? Used to come to the Parker House. So as recently as just a few years ago, one of the famous guests who came by was Joan Rivers, our beloved Joan Rivers. And she came in with an extended family, young and old, and just came into the Parker House and said, Boston cream pie, we've got to have Boston cream pie. And so they served her and everyone. Were you there when that happened? When they served her Boston cream pie. So that continues to follow to this day. Now, there is something that our general manager doesn't like to talk about and doesn't believe in, but everybody likes to talk about it. And when your hotel is 160 years old, there are bound to be some ghosts. And the Parker House apparently has a few ghosts, okay? When you consider the number of people who have stayed there, or the number of people who have died there, there are bound to be ghosts there. For example, there was a very famous actress who named Charlotte Cushman, who in the 1850s was probably one of the most famous actresses in America. She, in fact, used to perform along with Edwin Booth, who I told you about before. She actually lived at the Parker House, and therefore she died at the Parker House. Allegedly, Charlotte Cushman's ghost has been seen there. She actually also stayed in the room that Charles Dickens stayed in, and people claim that they've seen Charles Dickens. Now, Harvey Parker himself was known for taking care of everything and always hovering and always being around and making sure that everything was just right, everybody was happy, everybody had everything they wanted, and many, many sightings of Harvey Parker have happened. There is a rumor that Stephen King, speaking of literary people, wrote a very famous short story about a room in the Parker House. And if you go on ghost tours in Boston, and if you read the ghost tour books about Boston, all of them will say that Stephen King stays at the Parker House when he goes to his beloved Red Sox games and wrote a short story that later became a short film based on the Parker House. So many people asked about this that I did this nutty thing. I called Stephen King's office, and I'm not sure why no one ever did that before, and they said, nope, it's not true. Nope, he doesn't stay at the Parker House. Nope, he doesn't go there when he goes to games. And no, that was related to a hotel in New York by, that's it. Okay, so I'm sorry about that one. I'd love to have that literary connection. It doesn't exist. However, there is one other political and literary connection, and that is this young man whose family grew up. His mother was born in the North End. His family grew up in the area, although they ended up in Hyannisport, and the family was called the Kennedys. The Kennedys had a long-time affection for the Parker House. When little John F. Kennedy was just a tot, he came to a party there and gave for his grandfather what many people say was his first public speech, wishing his grandfather a happy birthday and standing on a table there. But John F. Kennedy loved the Parker House so much that in 1946, when he decided to run for Congress, that he indeed did make his declaration there. He liked it so much that he was eating there and dining there and being a regular there when he wrote his book, Profiles in Courage, which indeed won the Pulitzer, whether he wrote it or not, but that's another story.
Ex-banana workers who had filed lawsuits, but whose conditions did not meet the official definition for azoospermia or oligospermia, and those are terms for absence of sperm in the semen or fewer than 20 million sperm per milliliter of semen. So workers without those conditions were not included in the settlement.